Well, you started and ran a shop in Italy, right?
I ran a telephone shop in Italy. Yeah. So
Here, that's impressive.
Yeah. So then, then I moved to Nebraska for the master, and then I decided to stay for the PhD, and now I'm basically done. So today I'm going to talk unit non-response, because it's a big topic now in the survey field, and I want to see how much should we really worry, and if there's something that we can do about that. I will give you really the latest research on non-response. And the way I'm going to do that is, first of all, telling you what is unit non-response in general, and then how you can compute response rates, because there's no, well, there are some standards, but not everybody's following them, and it's very difficult to compare response rate from two different surveys. Even if they use the same calculations, you can change them. Then I'm going to bombard you with trends in response rates from different places, academic, big federal agencies, and more kind of commercial. Then we're going to talk about no response bias, because that's really a key point of this entire talk, and how we can increase the response rate. Then some recent 2006 OMB's, the Office of Management and Budget, as a federal agency in DC, which is overseeing any kind of a survey that is done on behalf or for federal agencies. They put out some nice guidelines about, actually it's a very good reading, because it's like question and answers. You should read that. It's a free PDF online. I have a reference at the end. Then I will finish with some books on no response, and there's also a handout with very recent readings. I want to go back to the first slide, because I really like the picture of this. It's very nice. I mean, should you really hunt the last respondent and catch them and try to answer our survey? That's what we should do. Some people think so, some other people not. Ineke Stoop, she's working in Statistics Netherlands, and this is her dissertation. It's actually online. You can if you Google the title, you can find it for free. And the first part is great. It's a huge literature review of the entire no-response problem. Then you have some data more on the Netherlands. But what is a unit non-response? It's basically the failure. So I'm kind of negative, but it's the failure to obtain an interview from the selected person. And there are three main components. The failure to deliver the survey request. Let's say you go, it's a face-to-face interview, you go to that household, and there's a gate, it's a gated place, many places, especially in big cities, they have somebody at the door, they don't let you in. So you cannot even talk to the sample respondents. So you really fail, you cannot deliver the survey request. You don't even know if this person is eventually going to answer, but you can just do not have access. Then you have the refusals. People say, no, don't call me anymore, click, or just don't bother me, I'm sorry, I don't have time, I'm busy, any kind of. Then there is some people who are unable to participate for any reason. Unit is completely different from item no response. Item no response is the next step, and once you talk to somebody, then you have some item no response in the questionnaire from which you have to take care. So those are the two main concepts. Now, how do we compute response rates? Well, in 1998, APO, is the American Association of Public Opinion Research, started writing a small booklet. It was only face-to-face and telephone in 1998, and they tried to standardize response rates. Then they evolved to a mail, and very recently, the 2006, is incorporating into the surveys of specifically named persons. That's their definition. So it's not an opt-in panel. It's like when you have a sample, you randomly select this sample, say university students, you sample some emails, so you have a specifically named person, and then you send a survey request by either mail or email. Then you can use, and you do a web survey, then you can use the APO standards. It's the only For internet surveys, that's the only way to compute that. Nobody else ever published anything about how to compute response rates for web surveys. There are variations for phone. Callegaro was in 1982. They had the first kind of response rate calculation for telephone. APO is trying to enforce the standards in different ways. Well, first of all, by their own journal, Public Opinion Quarterly. If you do not use APO standards, you don't publish there. Very easy to enforce. The WAPOR journal, the International Journal of Public Opinion Research, is doing the same. Also, the American Political Science Review now, they say, wait, if you want to publish here, please convert the response rate into some kind of APO standards. CIMO is the Council of Market and Organization. Is basically the legal section of the entire survey industry, based in DC. CIMO just recently, in December 2006, endorsed APO standards. Said, this is a good way to compute response rates. APO really work well in the US, they don't really work well outside the US. So if you have to do some international survey, APO it's a very good starting point, but you have to do some adaptation. And that makes sense, depending on the situation. So for example, for mail surveys, APO is using the USPS codes when a mail is coming back, and those are very specific to the US situation. And so you can adapt, but it's a very good reading. It's becoming now almost a book, is 48 pages, single space. So it's very, very tricky, complicated. Now recently, the Office of Management and Budget in DC, once they wrote that booklet telling people how to do surveys and answering common questions, they suggest to use APO standards. Even if for some surveys you cannot do that. For example, if you have an establishment or business surveys, and the definition of establishment surveys is that instead of sampling and talking to people, you sample establishments, can be schools, can be businesses. But for that case, the APO is not really taking care. Census Bureau, they have a response rate calculation document online that can take care of establishment surveys response rate. For panel surveys, there's nothing yet, because also for panels, very complicated because you have the initial response rate and then you have wave 2 wave response rates, so you can call them re-interview rates, plus you have the complication of if you have some kind of eligibility rules that make sure that some people were not eligible in the first wave and then they become eligible the second wave because, for example, they were 17 and now they become 18. So those are complicating the entire response rate calculation for panel surveys. Now, having said that, let me get my hand up to see where we are. Let's do an example just to get familiar with the terminology of APO. I cannot go through all the response rate calculation. There are so many formulas. I just give you to the document. But I wanted to start with an example with telephone RDD surveys. This is the example just for that. And it's very similar to face-to-face, but there are specific cases for telephone. So you start with your pool of phone numbers, okay, that you can be, even if that, for example, you buy from a company or you have somehow. Then there are two cases. If you can assess the eligibility of the person, you go on a route, and if you cannot access, you have the cases of unknown eligibility. And eligibility are dictated by your survey. It can be, I want to talk to anybody of age, so it's 18 or 19 in Nebraska. You know that Nebraska is 1 year more. Can be, oh, I'm really looking for some specific population. Classic example, well, let's do a pre-election poll and screening for likely voters. And so, every company has their own way to screen. They ask some kind of questions, they come up with a threshold, and then they keep going with the interview or they don't. Questions are, did you vote in the last election? How likely are you going to vote? In those kind of questions. So that's another screening. Well, so once you assess eligibility, somebody can be eligible or not eligible. If somebody is eligible, you have the response. Everybody is happy. But sometimes you have partial interviews. So you have a complete that, for import, is called I, and P partial. Partial interviews are really not standardized by import. Any, let's say, principal investigator is doing their own call to see what constitutes a partial. Some people are saying, well, you know, if you answer maybe 50% or more questions, I consider it partial. Some other people, and I am on that side, say, well, I don't really care what you answer. I want you to answer the key questions of my survey. If you don't answer those, I cannot really call it partial. You know, it's just data I cannot use. Some other people say, well, if you answer everything, but I don't get your demographics that generally a telephone survey are asked at the end, I cannot use your data. So I consider that a partial, or sometimes I'm even more strict, I don't even consider that. I just throw it away because I don't have the demographics. Some other people are working more with imputation and other systems just to, you know, to get the best, not to throw away anything. If you have a response, you also have no response, and those are the three cases already talked. You have refusals, no contact, and other no interview. No contact is when you generate a telephone poll, you randomly select somebody somehow, like last birthday method, and you say, okay, you know, now I have to talk to Mario. And the person on the phone says, okay, Mario is not here, he's coming back after 5 o'clock. You call at 5 o'clock, this person is not there. Keep calling. Remember, those are final disposition codes. So for each code, the interviewer is giving a code depending on the software or any kind of method. And only when you close the survey period, you use those to calculate the response rates. So that's the final disposition code. I'm sorry, no contact. I tried 5 times. Also, it depends on the budget of your survey. You generally establish with the client how many callback you want to do. Is it 5, 10, 14, 20? Maybe I will be stepping in and say, no, 20 is too many. Actually, I have an example of that and how it's going to impact response rate. And then you have all the not eligible that for telephone is kind of easy to understand. You have out of sample, you get a fax or a data line, and you have a non-working disconnect, very common. Some kind of weird noise, you don't really know what's going on, and the interviewer says, okay, just... you have a no residence, so you talk to a business. So you generally, your sample is basically pre-screened for you know, households, but sometimes you still have a business for some reasons. And then you get a not eligible respondent, so and quota field if you do some kind of quotas. All those cases are not going to be inside any kind of formula for it because they do not count against the response rate. You're basically wasting time and money. So the less cases you can get, so the best, the more like purified sample you can get. Some companies, they have a computer doing calls for you and cleaning up the entire sample. They get a fax or a data line, they take it out. So the interviewer is only picking up when somebody is actually picking up the phone and they start talking. So the computer is doing the entire screening. For some of cases, of course, you really need to talk to somebody to assess eligibility. Unknown eligibility, very tricky with telephones. Let's say that you have no answer for the entire survey. Keep calling, number is working, so it's not going to be here, it's not a disconnect, it's a no answer. What do you do? Is it a business? Is like a phone hidden in a basement of the university that nobody answers? Or is it not even, is even unplugged? Who knows? What do you do? Unknown eligibility cases are really counting against the response rates, I'm sorry. And there are some ways of fixing that, but it's very difficult sometimes. You really have to make some judgment calls. So at the end, we have 4 kinds of rates that Info is using. Response, cooperation, refusal, and contact rate. And you use those symbols to do your calculations. And for telephone, especially for telephone, you have E that is and you can estimate E actually in 7 ways. There's another nice reading to read on the ECO website. E is basically the proportion of cases of unknown eligibility that are eligible. E can really change the way you compute E can really change your final response rate. You know, the Callegaro method is the method that people are mostly using because it's the easiest. It's basically saying, okay, I just compute it based on what I know already. So because I have this pool of phone numbers and I know the ratio of eligible to not eligible, I use that ratio for my cases of uneligibility and I put it there, and then I have my response rate calculated. Studies done demonstrate that if you use this method, you're really a little bit underestimating your response rate. That's it. So some rates, I cannot, there are so many. I just put two. The first one is response rate 2 is used a lot because you can use the partial, and you can see that you divide everything by the refusal, non-contact, and other, and then the cases of uneligibility. Response rate 4 kicks in the estimated of E. So if you use a response rate 4, your rate is a little bit higher, depending on E, of course. Cooperation is just a rate. It's very useful for your interviewers, for example, to see how successful they are, because it's a rate that is taking into account basically the number of people you talk to and the number of people who refuse to hear them in the denominator. And then you have the real refuse rate and the contact rate that is taking into account anybody you can talk to. So sometimes in some papers they report the contact rate, and you don't really know what your response rate is. It can be very different. So APOR suggests to report everything, not all the rates, of course, there are so many. And APOR is also suggesting to report the final outcomes for each. There are some tables at the back of the paper. So now let's talk about some trends in response rate. Let's start with academic. Okay, generally they do better in telephone surveys. I have some telephone, at the end I will have some face-to-face. This is a response rate to University of Michigan survey of consumer attitudes. It's a historic survey done in US. Until 76 was done by face-to-face, and it's with telephone. As you can see, there is a very, not very steep, but I would say very smooth decline of response rate. It's like a nice example of fitting a regression map. Perfect. And unfortunately, the coefficient is negative. That's something you don't like. It's going down. Well, is the refusal rate going up? Apparently not much. But in the last years, look at that. Apparently so. Remember that anytime you read a paper about trends in response rate, when you compare this data, you really have to think also about what the survey company is doing to keep up with the response rate. So, they might have increased the number of calls, they might have retrained their interviewers to do refusal conversion. So you cannot really keep all those aspects still, and then, because it's not an experiment, those are real data, so you cannot do that. What we know generally is that survey companies are really trying to do more, to call more, and it's becoming more and more expensive to get an interview. So they do that, and still the response rate is going down. Well, non-contact rate, interesting. So the non-contact rate, remember, is the rate where I try to talk to my respondent that I randomly selected in this case. For any reason, I'm sorry, at the end I have to classify this final code as no contact. Going up very quickly, I would say. In 79, the first time they started, there was almost nothing, and then they go up to 15 or even more %. All right. Let's see what happens in the commercial world. It's a Gallup study, a random dialing study. 5 call design only, so only 5 calls. For a Gallup client, we don't know which client. Those are the contact rates. So this is the other side of the coin of the non-contact rates I just showed you before. As you can see, they're really going down from 70% to almost 55%. Contact rate. Look at answering machines going up very quickly from almost 5% to more than 15%, 16%. And response rates. The 5-code design, as you can imagine, you don't have much chances to talk to people, and you can see that the response rate is going down to 20%. So now we really are talking to a minority of our initial sample. We're really getting an opinion of 20% of our initial sample. The good part, I like this study because they didn't change anything in their code design. It's always 5-code design. They also use more or less the same interviewers and yet changes. And
I have one quick
yes.
question. Why is it that September-ish is so bad?
If you look at your load.
yeah, it's a good question. I do not know, and I was reading the paper and I couldn't find. Maybe I don't know, I missed something. I guess there are variation maybe in the interviewing team or something, but they try to keep everything steady. Yeah, but you're right. I was wondering the same. Now move again to telephone study done for the National Immunization Survey. Very sophisticated design, a lot of callbacks, trying to do the best. As you can see, they start from a very high response rate. They start from an 87% in 1995. That's great for a telephone. Look at how quickly they go down to, well, not, to the kind of 70%. Then they have this peak. That's when IRB stepped in and said, okay, you have to stop calling people. And they reduced the number of callbacks. The only way they were able to raise the response rate was to start giving incentives. So that's the explanation of the increase again of the response rate. So they had to change something to keep up with the response rate. They couldn't call people anymore. So they had to do that. And they're using CASO response rate, so it's a little bit different than APOR. Kind of similar to response rate 4, I would say, but I guess they in 1995, because APOR started in 1998, they already started with CASO and then they keep going with the same rate, so they couldn't do that. But just at least they are using the same calculation. So this paper is forthcoming in the new telephone survey methodology book from Wiley, coming out this year, and also this paper is coming out in the same book, and this is table summarizing, I don't know, many surveys done from news media and government contractors from 1996 to 2005, and they give you an idea of the ranges. So we are on a 30% response rate for telephone, contact rate of 67%, cooperation rate 44%, and refusal rate of 29%. Still, the 30% of people are interested. But those are means, so you really need to check the range, and it's amazing. I mean, you go from a 4% response rate here to 70%. But you can see that 70% seems to be very high, and that's not, they were able to get 140. It's a nice paper. It's already available online, a draft. You can Google it. Well, so we see how commercial and academics are doing. Let's see the gold standard. Let's see what are the response rate for, and the problem that the federal agencies in US have. I'm very glad I can use this data because they're very, very new. They just were given to me before public release by Nancy Bates of US Census, and I need to spend some time to show you this, to explain this chart. There is a JUS paper in 2001 where they used the same data, but unfortunately they stopped to 1999. So I thought it was much better to use this data. In fact, very much happy. All these surveys are done. At least the first interview is done by face-to-face interviewers. So that's why you can compare them. Do not look at the American Community Survey because it's still it's done by mail, so don't check that. But all the other surveys are done by face-to-face, and they're just checking the first interview data. Because many of those are kind of panel with any kind of design, like the SIP is a panel, the CPS is a rotating panel, you are in for 8 months. So, they just use the first interview face-to-face to compute the no-response rate. This is a no-response rate that is composed by refusals, no-contact, and everything else. As you can see, for any survey, I mean, I can tell you all the acronyms if you want. Consumer expenditure diary, consumer expenditure quarterly, CPS is the current population survey done to measure unemployment rates, for example. National crime victimization survey, national health interview survey, survey of income and poor participation, American community survey, and the American household survey. And remember, those are federal agencies, so they are best interviewers. They have a lot of, they communicate trust. I mean, we are really talking about the gold standard, something that very difficult. Not generally academic and private comment cannot reach, and it's a face-to-face. So you have an increase of no response, and they go up, depending on the design. How many times they try to go for the CIP, for example, for the CPS, because it's done every month. They cannot keep going back to the same household. They cannot, because otherwise a month is gone, and so they have to collect the data anyway. Refusal rates. Those rates are a little bit more difficult to interpret. Sometimes they go up and they go down again. Well, Census is really doing a lot of training for their interviewers to do refusal conversion. So successfully here, they were able to lower the percentage of refusals for the consumer expenditure diary and the consumer expenditure quarterly. And here they are steady. More or less steady. It seems that if you train your interviewers, I don't know if they are using incentives. Generally, they do not, or not that much. Federal agencies don't really like to use incentives that much. It's also written in the OMB booklet. So they are kind of steady and keeping it down, let's say. But still, we are on a 12%. And it's a face-to-face, so this is really one of the lowest refusal rates. If you saw before for telephone, we have 30% refusal rates. Now, this is a slide that is telling a lot about how society is changing. And if you put this together with the non-contact of before, you can really see that even for face-to-face survey, people are not around anymore. It's not like in the 70s where somebody was always at home answering the phone and answering the door for the interviewer. Now, even if they try, I mean, this is the final outcome, so you don't know how many times they try. You still have an increase in the final code of no one home. And depending on the survey design, you can go up to 6% or down. So, putting together that with the non-contact rates, you can see that now the respondent is mobile. You have mobile respondents. They can catch them on the phone, and even if you go at home, they are not there. And you try to go at any time. The viewers are becoming smarter. They go later. You pay them more. They go after 5 o'clock. They go on Saturday morning. They retry, and still you have I would say, you see that any survey is really increasing. So now that I depressed you a lot, let's talk about non-response bias, because that's what really counts. And this is the new trend of the literature. We have a lot of papers. We had a new POQ quarterly just devoted on non-response, actually. So what really counts is how many people, what really counts is the difference between the respondent and non-respondent on that survey item that you are measuring. If the non-respondent think, believe, or act or behave in the same way that the non-respondent, you don't have any problems. But you have also to see how many of those are the non-respondents. So it's a combination of two factors. How many are the non-respondents, how different they are from your respondent. But, they can be different for some variables, not for others. So you can have bias in some variables, and for other variables, even if you have a low response rate, there's no change. In order to do that, Bob Groves just published a paper where he did a huge meta-analysis on studies where somehow, and I will tell you how, the researcher was able to measure the no-respondent answers using different ways. So you have two data. You have the data of the respondent and the data of the no-respondent. Now, and you also have the no-response rate. Now, using this formula, this is the absolute value of 100 multiplied by, that survey. I think there are 230 different variables here. What this chart is showing you that no matter your response rate, you still have bias even when you have a 15% no response rate. That means that response rate is only one indicator of the survey quality, not the only indicator. It doesn't mean that we have to forget and just going happily with low response rates anyway, because you're really stretching the boundaries. When you have a very low response rate, your bias, even if the difference between the no-respondent and the respondent is very low, you're multiplying that by a big number because you have a lot of people who do not answer. So I'm not saying you forget about the response rate. I'm just saying, well, maybe, and that's what OMB is saying, maybe we really have to include in any survey we do a no-response component study. That's what we need to do. Every time we do a survey, we need to try to study no-response in order to have an external quality criteria to say to our client, okay, we did also a no-response bias study, and on some variables, it's not going to be big. For some other variables, maybe you have some problems. This is an example where response rates are not associated with bias. And this is a study in which I was involved. So you have a response rate here, and you have bias measured in exit polls. As you know, in exit polls it's easy because you have a gold standard, so you can check for each precinct. Those are Mexican data. We reproduce exactly the data from US. What this chart is showing you, because there is no trend that you can guess, we tried any kind of possible function and it doesn't really fit. Or if it fits, it fits like, And we are reproducing American, US examples. What we are saying here is that even if you have a very low response rate for exit polls, your bias is not really to be affected. So this is one case in which response rate doesn't have an effect on the final estimates, even if it's changing so much. But this is a special case. We are just talking about exit polls, right? And so don't use this for any other survey. Now, if you wanted to increase the response rates, there are different options that you can use. You cannot use all of them, maybe because you don't have enough money or time, but I like to use this chart that is slightly modified from Groves. This is the Groves et al. The survey, the classic handbook, survey methodology handbook. It's a very nice chart because it is breaking down the way you can increase the response rate by three sections: the contactability of the respondent, the initial decision, the final decision. So I think it's a very nice chart, especially useful for this kind of presentation. So if you want to increase the response rate, what can you do? Well, you can increase the number and timing of calls. So the more you call or the mail out questionnaire, the more reminders you send, you're eventually going to increase the response rate. You can increase the length of the data collection. That's very important because, as we saw before, you cannot catch people anymore. So the non-contact rate is going up. The only way to increase is to keep going after your respondent at any time of the day, any time of the week, so you have a chance, you increase your chances to finally contact this person. Sometimes you don't have this luxury. You do a pre-election poll on the phone, I'm sorry, you have to close the data collection period because then you have to vote or do something. So, in this case, you cannot do anything to increase the response rate. Interviewer workload, you can do something if you interview, especially for face-to-face. And then, if interviewers are giving you some extra information, you can, let's say, asking a neighbor when this person is back. You can use those kind of para-data to increase your response rate. Then the initial decision is when eventually you talk to somebody. You can modify your interview behavior, so training of refusal conversion really works. Sponsorship is important. In a sense, you're spending $billions of dollars every 10 years to do an awareness campaign of US Census. So that's why they do it, for the initial decision. If there are posters around saying, you know, you need to answer the census form, you're eventually going to increase the response rate. Pre-notice letters are working out very well. They work well with with the mail and telephone, for example. There are examples of that. So sending a postcard saying, hey, you know, we are going to eventually send you a questionnaire, we are going to call you, is working. Incentives, of course, are increasing response rate. Some people are reducing the burden of the questionnaire and say, well, and this is working well for like kind of soft refusal. People who are like, you know, not really convinced, they say, okay, just answer me 5 questions, the key questions of your questionnaire, and I won't talk to you more. So you kind of like stealing those answers and run away. So, use of a proxy. If you allow to talk to somebody else, you increase the response rate, but then you have to be careful when you do data analysis to see if the proxy is really as knowledgeable as the self-answer. So you have some problems here when you use proxy. But proxy answers are not always bad. It depends on the topic. Interviewer match, there are some studies matching the interviewers to the, they do generally is race and gender match. Sometimes it's increasing response rate, but the results are not very super clear. Then when you are at the final decision, you can switch interviewers, put your best interviewers to do refusal conversions, okay? Switch mode, another way that is used really at an increasing rate, especially in the US. Switch mode to increase your final response rate. You can have a two-phase sampling, meaning that you sample the no respondents. You take a sample of the no respondents and you go after them with your best interviewers, with your best effort, just concentrate on those no respondents. And it's done. It's done a lot. Persuasion letters. It's done for panel surveys because you have already the contact information and they are really tailored letters saying, no, I'm sorry, we really need your answer because the study is a state, da da da. Now, how can we estimate no response error? That's a big question. Because if we cannot talk to the no respondents, how can we measure the bias and then eventually see if our survey estimates are, let's say, on the right track? Well, there are different ways, and I did this chart to show you different ways that are used in the literature to measure the no respondent. Basically, if you take this chart and you apply this chart to Bob Gross meta-analysis, you can classify each study that he used, because it's a meta-analysis, he used study as data, you can classify one of each study inside these categories. And let's go from the left to the right. The big distinction is the one I did on some or most variables and on all variables. That's the main distinction it's very important from a conceptual point of view. Many times you get external information, but they are not the same variable that you're really studying. Many times you get the demographics of the no respondents, but that doesn't mean that you have the answers of the no respondents. On your survey item can be a health behavior or a political opinion or anything. So you can use interviewer supplied information. The interviewer can observe something and you can start an exit poll example. In exit polls, the no response, the refusals are measured by the interviewer, who is filling up a chart saying, this person who refused is male, I guess the race, and I guess the age. So I have information on the no respondents. That's an example of interview supplied information. Comparison with aggregate data. Yeah, you can do that. Actually, it's done very commonly. You have now the website of US Census where you can pull data at a very specific level, and you can say, okay, you know, at the end of my data collection, how far off are generally on some demographics variables. So I have too few young people. generally use this method to do, then you use it reversely to do weights. So you use the information to weight your data at the end. If you are generally big agencies like census, you can link the data and use some administrative data. But you know, this really, you really need that. You need, it's not an information that's easy to get. Sampling frame information. Let's say that you go to schools and you sample schools and you already have some information from the frame, let's say percentage of males and male and females, and then you see, okay, no, I'm sorry, for this school, for some reasons, we didn't get enough females. So, you know, we got 30%, but the ratio is 50%. So I have to do something about it. So remember, those are some variables. Then there are these methods can give you an idea of the bias, but most of the times it's a bias that is not really the bias on the variables of interest. If you're measuring, you know, percent of people smoking, you don't get smoking percentages from those variables. Generally, no, unless you use another survey. Well, if you use another survey, I don't see why you have to do your survey anyway. You know, I'm very open on that. Or, you know, just save money and do some extra data analysis. On all variables, that's the best way to go. Very expensive. Subsample non-respondents and go after them. If you have a panel, you know who people were and are, go after them and try to talk to the dropouts. And then those three methods are just very similar, they just use different terminology. And I call it a surrogate because I didn't want to use the term proxy because proxy is generally proxy interview. Some people are saying, well, I use the converted refusers as my no-respondent. And there is actually there's a paper on the no-response book by Michael Callegaro where he used the converted refusers in a telephone poll, political poll, as no-respondents, and he measured their political attitudes, comparing that political attitude with the initial respondents, I would say, the people who just say, yeah, I just do the survey now. He didn't find many differences. It doesn't mean that they are not, but some people are using the reluctant respondents, so it's very similar, and some people are using late respondents. In a mail survey, for example, the people who really answer you after you send them 10 postcards, well, you're basically saying, okay, maybe those people are really refusers, but because I tried so much, they're really answering. So those are ways you can use to assess a no-response bias, and those are the ways that were used in this meta-analysis, and all these papers are using one or multiple of those strategies just to come up with the bias. Almost done here. 2006, the Office of Management and Budget came up with a booklet, question and answer. It's actually called Question and what is that? Questions and answers when designing surveys for information collections. So if your company is bidding for a survey that eventually is going to be sponsored by any kind of federal agency, you have to follow these guidelines. And they say ICR is the information collection request. If basically you expect a response rate of 80%, basically never. In 2007, I would say basically never 80%, not even from federal agency surveys, especially if it's telephone. But I say, if you expect 80%, okay, don't worry too much. So they basically came up with a number. Well, Bob Gross would say, well, even with an 80% response rate, you would still have, you might have some bias anyway. But they say, okay, 80% looks good enough for us. Well, if you have lower than 80%, so between the lines you read every time, or 99% of the time, what you should do a no-response study. That's a big step in the survey work. Basically now, almost any federal agency's sponsored survey is going to embed already in the design a no-response bias study. Very useful for us, very interesting, also from kind of more academic point of view. But that's the outcome. Now, they also give you advice on how can you measure potential no-response bias. Well, first of all, you should talk to us, so that's good, for us. If you have a job, talk to survey statisticians and survey methodologies and try to assess the bias. Well, this is an interesting point. At the minimum, agencies should plan to compare respondents and non-respondents on information available from the sampling frame. So if you have a sampling frame, if you have an external, at least do that. Also, you should try any other external information to match the sampling frames. As you can see, they are basically going back to my chart and say, okay, you should use those methods. Well, and then they also say, if this kind of information is not available, well, why don't you do some matching, for example, by phone number and get down the zip code and use the census long form, then now you can find the American Fact Finder, and then in the future will be eventually the American Community Survey, and try to see if there are differences. But again, remember that those data that are in the American Fact Finder are generally demographics data. They don't tell you anything about their opinion, their behavior, or any kind of data. But at least we can do that. You can use that to weight your data, for example. And then again, this is the idea of the panel longitudinal survey. Check and see, are you systematically missing people on some kind of characteristic? You are studying, I don't know, poverty in a panel, and then you eventually realize that the panel dropouts are more poor than the average. Well, you have a problem with this panel, you have to do something about it. Then again, where you also say when there are no good sources of information, agencies can also use additional follow-up procedure with an abbreviated questionnaire. You know, that's another concept that we just talked about. Go after the non-responder with a short question. Well, sometimes follow-up studies, this is the follow-up probability sample of non-respondents. And then the idea of the refusal converted is back here. Okay? This is my last slide, and then I can take any question you want. Those are some no-response books. Pioneer book. This is more about why people participate in a survey, written by John Goyder from Canada, as a sociologist. Then we have another classic, more about political polls, printed by University of Michigan. This book is more about how interviewers are approaching. It's a UK study. The latest three books are actually this book, done in 1998, Rose and Cooper. How they did this book? They were able to link information because they work directly with with census. They were able to link information from the census, short and long form, to directly the same no respondent that answered. There was no respondent in another survey. So that's a design that is nobody else can do this study. But it's an interesting study, it's done only for household. Then this book came out after a conference, it's an edited book, and this is the latest by Ineke Stoll from Statistics Netherlands. Yes, her dissertation on the field, on the topic. It's a very, very nice book on no response. And then you have all the references here. You have import standards, forthcoming papers, our forthcoming paper, and then there's a new handbook that is going to be published very soon by Lawrence Erbaum. It's called International Handbook of Survey Methodology. And there's a nice paper, nice chapter by Peter Lin talking about no response. The special issue of POQ, and then Bob Totora paper on a Slovenian journal that is available online, when he's talking about some Gallup study and the trend of response rate during the last, I guess, 9 years or something. And I'm done. 1 o'clock, so you can take any question. Yes?
I have a question on the whole issue of going after those final respondents.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hunting the last.
One of the problems with that, and it shows up over and over again in literature, that the people who are most difficult to get are the ones that's kind of a classic measure for response propensity, right? So people who have low respondent propensity have a high number of contacts.
Yes.
And they're notoriously bad at satisfies. And the data is really promising. The evidence is pretty strong.
Yeah.
Enormous amount of measurement error, satisficing.
That's that's a that's a big problem. It doesn't mean that if you go after the no response, you can get the same quality data from the response. So it's really worth to try to squeeze and increase the response rate at any cost. So one of the messages from this, this talk is we shouldn't really blindly go after response rate and try to do anything to maximize, because again, now there are more and more studies showing that maybe if you really almost harassing respondents, you don't really get the data, the quality of the data that you're looking for. So why do you have to do it, and why spend time, money, and resources to do it? That's a good point, very good point. Yeah.
Assuming you do it, how many do you recommend? I mean, obviously there's a magic number, but like how large of a sample do you need of the non-respondents?
That's a good question, and I don't have an answer. I mean,
as you can guess.
Many times it's just a question of resources. Doing a subsample of non-respondents, send them the best interviewers, maybe pay them, and then you have the problem of incentives. Interviewers don't really like incentives, because they're, especially face-to-face interviews, because they have a point. They're saying, why should we reward the bad behavior? We are rewarding people who don't answer, who treat us, let's say, interviewer badly, because they're not treating them very well. And then at the end, we give them money. Well, it doesn't really, it's not, in fact, if you read the OMB guidelines, they really talk about incentives as really the last step you should do. And it's an interesting take on the federal agencies have their own take on the incentives. Some other, people are saying, well, time is money, so I just pay people to get the answers. Are we getting the same quality? Well, maybe not, maybe yes. Some panel respondents are paid, but all of them is paid. So it's different. For example, PSID, Panel Study of Inca Dynamics, historic panel in US, started in 1968. They started with $5 in 1968, and they're up to $60 now. But to everybody, not only to the refusers or the converted or the non-respondents. But sometimes agencies do that because they, at the end of the data collection field, they start doing some computational response rate, and sometimes the client is expecting a magic number for some reasons. They want 75% or whatever. And so what do you do? What do you do? You go back and you try all of them, all of those methods. But in general, sometimes you cannot be in the field forever, so you need to do something, and you start paying people or losing up the rules of who is answering. So you say, okay, well, now we accept proxy answers, or do any kind of other design. Sometimes people switch mode if they can. Switching mode can increase response rate, but then you have a problem of mode effects. So you can, not always, but you have to look for mode effects problem when you switch mode. A classic example can be face-to-face interview. You can never contact this person because every time you go to this household, nobody's answering or nobody's at home. If you have a phone number, you just start calling until you find, and then you do the interview on the phone instead of face-to-face. So maybe in this case, shouldn't expect huge mode effects. General mode effects are when you switch from a self-administered to an interviewer-administered mode. But still, you have a potential for mode effects. You can do something. But yeah, it's difficult to tell you a number. But these OMB rules are. I mean, it's interesting because they're basically saying, okay, guys, we need to start doing no-response bias studies. And so when you budget your survey, leave some extra money to do that. They're also very good for weighting, so I would say it's not, they're always good. Especially the easy stuff you can do. This stuff is kind of easy. comparison with aggregate data, especially in US, with the census fact finder, you can really go down to a very specific regional level and check what's going on. So that's something you, I guess, should be a routine. That's the idea. Should be a routine investigation. Maybe you just get some demographics out of it. You don't really get, you know, the survey estimates that you need, but at least you have an idea. You can try to wait and see if it's going to make a huge difference in the data. And again, all these studies are really done on, this paper is based on those studies trying to estimate the non-respondents in any way possible you can imagine. And you see the results. But this is an interesting study. And it's the only study actually done so far. But again, I mean, in order to do the study, I mean, those are 30 papers, not many, I would say. It means that there's not, at the moment, no response research is not super high anyway. There are many studies, or people do them and they don't publish them. But I guess the message is, in a period of declining response rates, we can try to increase the response rate, all these different methods, but at the same time, we should do a no-response bias study. That's the final message of this talk. Response rate is not going to go up. That's the idea. You know, that's a trend in every industrialized country in the world. So even when you go to Europe and you see the trend, but even in US, I mean, if you read papers published in 1980, they are saying the same. Response rate is going down. What should we do? And again, what should we do? What should we do? Then eventually, you know, the new trend is say, okay, what should we do? Well, we can increase it somehow, but we should do a no-response bias study. But if the trend in the literature is really that. Even in the 70s, people were complaining of declining of response rate, and now, you know, now everybody is settling. You know, 20% now response rate for a telephone call. Many companies rate. If you know, 50 years ago, you couldn't publish, you couldn't even say that you had a 20% response rate for telephone calls because this data, you know, I want to see that. Now, oh yeah, great. Just lowering the standards, basically. And one reason is not only because people are refusing more, but is the non-contact big problem. Yeah.
One point and a question.
Yeah.
You mentioned about the advertising and so forth for the census. This year they have an RFP out for $470 million just for advertising. That's advertising and survey research. It's a $13 billion study. They'll spend $13 billion on the 2010 election. Yeah. Or 2010
census.
And they've got the RFP is $470 million. I know because Gallup's going after that $130 million to do the survey work on it. That's a combination of survey work and advertising. Especially
for some subpopulation that have very low, I would say initial, because then census is going after with enumerators to people who don't return the form. But census response rates are going down, and they, you know, they were able to keep up the last time, and you know, going up a little bit, doing a lot of efforts, and the redesigning, printing on the letter. Your answer is required by law. That was a big change in comparison to other years. They're trying to do everything because, you know, for them, a 1% response rate is converting so much money to spend to send out a numerator. So even if they can increase by a few percentage points, they can save so much money and time, of course, because you know it's much easier to process a census form with a scanner than having an enumerator going after the non-respondents trying to get some kind of data from them. So yeah, it's a big project. It's a big
interesting. For 2000, for $100 million per percent.
Yeah.
And the expectation is that it would be $120 million per 1% in 2010. So that's why we really put so much money into advertising.
Yeah, so they're really pushing. Yeah, well, they're pushing the sponsorship to push the initial decision to answer.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Who's looking at one of the early issues on response? Looked at urban versus non-urban.
Oh yes.
Urban was notoriously
bad. Yeah.
Is that still true, or is that starting to even out, or is it?
I saw some data and still true. For both telephone and face-to-face.
Yeah.
For face-to-face, for accessibility problem, you know, if you talk to interviewers in Chicago, they say, hey, some buildings are just out. We cannot go in. There's no way. We may try. You know, it's just
Are there differences in mode?
The
With
face-to-face.
the Earl Rubin? Earl.
and urban. Oh,
Urban differences in mode.
I should check some references, but yeah, you're right, Alan. At the beginning of the survey literature, this kind of people were using the urban and not urban variable to break down the data. Now it seems that people are not really using that so much, but I don't see why it's changed. Actually, it's still out
Curious
there.
if it still persists. We're seeing differential non-response rates across.
We know. I mean,
urban.
we know. I know from even in Europe it's the same. I mean, it's just the now. Well, now it's discontinued the Belgium household panel had the same problem. Very low response rate in Brussels in comparison to others. So it seems to be common in many places, even not in the US. But yeah, that's another problem. So you can also take those information and try to tailor your effort. Actually, census is changing apparently the time. They are studying, like, what's the best time to contact a household? That's another interesting study. They say, okay, we know that from our effort, and we try from, you know, in these time ranges, the best success you can have it there. So then it's going to increase your cost because you need more interviewers to go at that time, because they are basically working only or almost only at that time. But there are a lot of data you can get from interview observations and use them instead of just not taking them. So all these para data can really help to increase the response rate eventually. Or use strategies to go after people, almost becoming like a private investigator. That's, you know, say, okay, you know, I know so much about this person that I know when I can talk to this person. All right.
Well, thank you very much.